The next paper is by Dr. Sugata. He is the Associate Professor of Art History at Berkeley, University of California. I have a little note here to read from him. Let's see. Yes. His paper is entitled The Buddha as the Yogin, The Making of a Nationalist Art History. There we go. And here's his note. My sincerest apologies for not being here with you today. I imagine that Robert's talk has already given us a wonderful entry into thinking more deeply about the relationship between Buddhism and yogic practices. Moving forward in time, my paper turns to the late 19th and the early 20th century to further examine the relationship between asceticism, the body of the Buddha, and yoga. I begin with a 1953 essay in the American journal Art News, where the art historian Stella Kramrich had proposed that the practice of yogic breathing had allowed the carnal body in Indian sculpture to dissolve into the subtle body, foreshadowing emergent countercultures, Allen Ginsberg and transcendental meditation, that would soon unsettle the dreariness of the 1950s. Kramrich brought the non-European body into mainstream American art writing. The argument, of course, appears somewhat earlier in her writings from the 1930s, where she suggested that yogic practice based on moving breath, prana, along the internal channels of the body shaped Indian sculpture. For Kramrich, the movement from the corporal physicality of early Buddhist art to the more sensuous ethereality, in her words, the soft, delicate, dreamlike enchantment of 5th century sculpture, was a result of yogic breathing that gave, lost my part, Buddha's body. Art historians such as Kramrich thus brought together aestheticism and asceticism, image-making and yogic breathing as an embodied philosophy of the body, into a singular field to articulate an imagined civilizational value for Indian art. To what extent did anxieties about the colonized male body impact this construction of the Buddha as the yogin? Without a doubt, the body mattered. The figure of the effeminate native male, caricatured in colonial discourse vis-à-vis the virile Englishman, had given rise to late 19th century assertions of an Indian masculine virility framed through yoga. Indian art history had been formulated under the shadow of the celebrated monk Vivekananda's credo of beef, biceps, and the Bhagavad Gita, a disciplining of the male body through Raja Yoga as a solution to Indian effeminacy under colonial rule. Art history, I suggest, offered a different response to the emasculating politics of colonialism. Rather than the hyper-masculine modern subject of Enlightenment rationality, capable of ordering the world as a reflection of his phallocentric self, early 20th century nationalist mythography cast the male body as a feminized, interiorized site, standing in for potent fantasies of spirituality and ethical religiosity. The colonial crisis in masculinity was thus mapped onto the male body within a gendered arena of nationalist ferment. This resignification of the body as both a sign and a space of national sovereignty was the most audacious maneuver that animated anti-colonial art history in the early 20th century. That the effeminate native male body was materialized through discourse as both natural and cultural is best illustrated in the French art historian Alfred Foucher's now infamous study on the Gandhara Buddha. Describing a sculpture of a Buddha from Hoti-Mardon, Foucher wrote in 1913, "Look at it at leisure. Without doubt, you will appreciate its dreamy and somewhat effeminate beauty, but at the same time, you cannot fail to be struck by its Hellenic character." Certainly, much ink has been spilt debating Foucher's assertion of the Greek origin of the Buddha image. It is nevertheless worthwhile to note that Foucher, at the same time, suggested that the effeminacy of the Gandhara Buddha was a result of native contribution, the hand of the Indian artist. It is this indigenization that led to the feminization of the Buddha image as a distortion of the ideal Greek male body. Foucher continues, "You take the body of a monk and surmount it with the head of a king. These are the two necessary ingredients of this curious synthesis. Iterated at a moment when eugenics, medicine, and muscular Christianity had inscribed the native male body as weak and feminized, Foucher suggested that the head of the Buddha image was the Greek contribution placed upon the effeminate native male body. However disparaging, Foucher's assertion was hardly incongruous when placed within the larger milieu of late 19th and 20th century Indology. Only 2 years before Foucher's lecture, the British art administrator, George Birdwood, had notoriously declared that a boiled suet pudding would serve equally well as a symbol of the Buddha's serenity of soul. Birdwood's comment was in response to this photograph of an 8th century Buddha from Borobudur that was being discussed at a Royal Society of Arts meeting in London. It was the body of the meditating Buddha, the yogic Buddha, which was the eye of this storm. The photograph, excuse me. The photograph of the Amoghasiddhi Buddha had been first published in the art historian E.B. Havell's 1908 Indian Sculpture and Painting as an exemplary illustration of the idealized yogic body. Here, Havell, a British scholar ideologue extremely sympathetic to this nationalist movement, had argued for an Indian conceptualization of the spiritualized body through practices based in yogic breathing. In rendering this body, Havell suggested, Indian artists ignored both strength and perfection of form. It was only by expurgating masculinity from the male body, Havell argued, that Indian artists could achieve an idealized body type. The photograph further heightened the metaphysical essence that the sculpture was seen to embody. Masking the architectural setting of the stupa itself, the sculpture was set against a black backdrop. Lighting was carefully manipulated to underscore the gracefulness of the alleged unmasculine body. A shadow falls over the abdomen, while the contemplative face with downcast eyes, the sinuous shoulders, and legs crossed in a yogic asana are emphasized, thus accentuating the meditating posture of the image. Freed from the physical limitations of the site, the meditative figure provokes the viewer-reader to engage with the image as an act of introspective contemplation. Unlike the frontal images of sculpture in situ that circulated through the Archaeological Survey's reports, the decontextualized photograph allowed Havell to recontextualize the image, through frames of theology, aesthetics, and introvert spirituality. To reinforce his argument on the relationship between nationalism, yoga, and the male body, Havell contrasted the Borobudur image with a photograph of a realistic sculpture of a Varanasi-based Shaiva ascetic. Labeling the sculpture as a decadent modern statuette, Havell compared the portrait of the emaciated yogi with his protruding ribs to the sensuous physicality of the Borobudur Buddha. Although both photographs were composed using similar techniques, including a masked background and dramatic lighting, the differences in psychological and moral signification were vast. Readers familiar with the trajectories of Buddhist art would surely not fail to see the uncanny visual similarity between the sculpture of the Varanasi-based yogi and Gandhara sculptures of the emaciated Siddhartha, fasting before he achieved enlightenment. Astutely offsetting images from the past and the present, Havell thus conjured a direct equivalence between realism learnt under 19th century colonial rule and the purported realism of Gandhara sculpture produced under the guidance of the illusory Greco-Roman artist. In both cases, the overt emphasis on outwardness, an attempt to visualize the male body realistically, had led to an inadequacy that was ultimately overcome by the Indian artist, or so Havell claimed, through a spiritual demasculinization, that is, through imagining the male body as without its masculine strength. Havell's 1911 Ideals of Indian Art further advanced his interpretation on the male body in Indian sculpture. Havell writes, in the images of Buddha, Indian artists were aiming at a divine type which combined all the physical perfections of male and female and transcended them both. Published around the time Foucher was condemning Gandhara sculpture as effeminate, Havell's text deftly subverted the authority of colonial discourse through repetition. While colonial orchestrations of the effeminate native male body as non-threatening had allowed for production of both racial and racist difference, Havell subverted the colonizer's intention by articulating an identical argument. For Havell, the perfection of the Buddha's body arose only from uniting both male and female physiognomies. It was demasculinization, or effeminacy, to use Foucher's vocabulary, that then became the hallmark of Indian art. Havell's text thus appropriated colonial discourse to re-articulate it yet again as a critique of the very text it appropriated. This resignification of the male body was, however, both performative and discursive. While the search for properly masculine bodies in wide-ranging fields, such as sports, psychiatry, and even yoga, had risen from an internalization of the anxieties over the virility of the native male body, Havell adopted an entirely different approach as the principal of the Calcutta School of Art. In the late 1890s, he began experimenting with the indigenization of the school's curriculum that led to the discarding of the plaster casts of Greco-Roman sculpture used in drawing classes, and the introduction of a pedagogy based on yogic meditative practices. As he himself claimed, the attempt to instruct students to draw through introvert mental visualization was closely analogous to earlier ritualized meditative practices. Equally significantly, the rejection of European art pedagogy premised on copying Greco-Roman male nudes needs to be read in conversation with the concurrent debates surrounding the origin of the Buddha image. The male body as a site of political struggle lay at the heart of the debate, linking cultural production to struggles over subjectivity, agency, and power. The struggle, I suggest, was paradoxically framed through a strategic embracing of the colonizers' aspirations in order to challenge the core definition of European hypermasculinity. The colonizers' claim of the effeminacy of the native male body was thus rewritten by nationalist ideologues as a desexualized, degendered asceticism purportedly inherent to Indic cultures. It is thus no surprise that Havell summarily hurled the Greco-Roman caste into a pond. At the same time, the artist Abhindranath Tagore was brought in to orientalize the school's curriculum. Over the next few years, Tagore too published a series of books that would distinguish Indian art as encompassing a transcendent aesthetic, with yogic meditation as its most distinctive characteristic. A 1914 essay by Tagore, for instance, examined pre-colonial conventions of visualizing the body that could be offered as an alternative to European academic realism. Focusing on text, such as, please excuse my Sanskrit pronunciation, the Shukranitsara, yes, a treatise on moral kingship, Tagore presented the male body through a claim to national sovereignty. Tagore had chosen his texts carefully. The 17th century text had merged the body of the king with the body of God to enunciate the monarch's divine sovereignty. It is this pre-colonial political theology as a corporal poetics of the body that allowed Tagore to liberate the colonized body from the prison house of colonialism. This then was a politics of early 20th century nationalist art history that challenged the European hyper-masculine body through appropriating the colonizers' logic of the native male as both feminized and untouched by modern mappings. The text suggestion of contemplative vision, yoga dhyana, rather than direct observation, pratyaksha, as essential to image making, allowed Tagore to use the text as a pedagogic tool. Tagore's own interpolation was centered on specific body postures discussed in the text. Writing on the triple bent posture of the Tribhanga, Tagore notes, this bending attitude, or the seeking pose of the male and female figure, is occasionally reversed so that the male assumes the female bhanga and the female assumes the pose of a male figure. Emphasizing the fluidity of gender in the divine body, that is, the reversibility of the markers of gender in sculptures of divine beings, Tagore laid out a theory that could account for the effeminate Buddha body. One of the key features of 5th century sculpture from Sarnath, unlike earlier Matsura sculptures, was a deployment of the Tribhanga. As you can see from the two images, the left one is from the 2nd century Matsura, and the right one is from 5th century Sarnath. The body of the Sarnath Buddha is slightly bent in the Tribhanga pose. Within a few years, the Sarnath Buddha would become central to a nationalist reclaiming of Indian art that brought together metaphysics and the feminized male body in a close bind. While paucity of time does not allow me to discuss this in detail, I want to briefly draw your attention to the illustrations that accompanied the text. Nandalal Bose, his illustration of the Tribhanga, described in the text as a literal rendering of the approved formula of the Shastras, shows a futuristic pedestalized body, desexualized in its angularity, its gender difficult to determine. By draining the body of both its gender and sexuality, of both its masculinity and femininity, Bose's drawing thus gave visual form to discourses surrounding the colonized male body. Precisely at this moment, we see the art historian and aesthete Ananda Swami emerging as a key voice. Traveling frequently to India between 1909 and 1913, Swami spent long periods with the Tagores in Calcutta. A woodcut print depicting Tagore's studio from 1909 shows a space where art making and adab, the quintessential Bengali form of sociability, blend into each other. Swami reaches out to a painting as a Tagore's read and smoke. A serpentine Swami, this is how Roger Lipsey describes the image, with his gold earrings, graceful fingers, bracelets and flowing hair, and Shah sprawled out on a low divan, is a textbook image of the languid, feminized Oriental male created from within the web of colonial governance. This cunning self-orientalizing, I propose, was a strategic gesture on part of Swami and the Tagores that played, and I use the word keeping in mind its performative nature, with colonial stereotypes of the effeminate native male. It is this play, a strategic self-essentializing, that allowed these intellectuals to push the colonized native body against its limits. Art history followed. Swami's critique of the Western preoccupation with Gandhara art was first articulated in a lecture at the 1908 Oriental Congress, where he argued for an independent evolution of an Indian artistic ideal. Positing a fundamental difference between the spirit of classical Greek art and Indian art, he argued that the former sought the mimesis of nature, whereas the latter sought its transcendence. In 1908, he also published his first major text, Medieval Sinhalese Art, a book that engaged with the Sukranitsara, the text Tagore would write about within a few years, to suggest that the Indian artist's dexterity in visualizing the transcendent body was dependent on his yogic skills. In the following year, Swami further explored the relationship between yogic practices and the ideal body in Indian art. Over the next few years, Swami would systematically pursue this strain of thought. His 1916 essay in the Burlington Magazine, for instance, begins with a statement. Before, however, we speak of the Buddha images, we must refer to a phase of religious experience, which plays a great part in the development of Buddhism. This is the practice of yoga. It was sculptures of the Buddha in the lotus posture from sites such as Mathura and Anuradhapura that allowed Swami to construct a fictitious link between the archetypal image of the seated yogin and early Buddhist art. Since yoga was indigenous to Indic cultures, the seated Buddha too was of Indian origin, Swami contended. His 1927 Art Bulletin essay on the origin of the Buddha image remains the most cited text on the debate. Here, Swami, yet again, brought together yoga and the Buddha's body to assert an authentic national art, a pure expression of Indic intellect and creativity. It was, however, with Stella Kramrich, who completed her dissertation on Buddhist sculpture in Vienna, that we find art history as a modern discipline turned on its head. Her 1933 Indian sculpture directly confronted the question of the effeminate Buddha body using theology and metaphysics. Kramrich suggested that the slenderness of the late 5th century Sarnath Buddha, in contrast to that tough body of early Buddhist sculpture, to use Kramrich's words, emerged because the vegetative or nature migrated into the body to make it its vessel. By invoking a recognizable anti-colonial nationalist trope that collapsed the vegetative and the feminine into a singular category of regenerative potential, Kramrich posited a reappraisal of the alleged effeminate Buddha. The Sarnath Buddha's soft, graceful proportions could only be materialized through a bodily absorption of the vegetal, the feminine, Kramrich argued. The transcendental male body, a body that could achieve sovereignty through a practice of corporal poetics, was thus feminized. Unlike Vivekananda's exhortations for the masculinization of the native male body through yoga as a response to colonialism, art history reworked the feminine yoga and anti-colonial nationalism into an arrangement that was resplendently inscribed onto the body of the Buddha. These early moments of art history then allow us to think of the multiple genealogies of the body. There is, I want to suggest, a particular urgency to do so. Over the last 3 decades, the 16-year boy venerated as an indexical sign of Rama, or as Rama himself, is being rapidly replaced by a beefy divine with muscles that can rival Sylvester Stallone's, and a politics fueled by vitriolic anti-minorityism funded by a global Hindutva. As new arrangements of global capital and nationalist chauvinism shape the masculinity, the mardangi, of the Indian male body today, I propose that a rupturing of this category might offer us a way of rethinking, reclaiming, and reworking an ethics of the body. Thank you.